I want to start with something I watched happen in a hospice room. The man was in his late 70s. He had 4 adult children. All of them came to visit. Most of them sat quietly, or asked the nurses questions they already knew the answers to, or cried in the hallway where they thought no one would hear. One of them didn't. She sat close to her father. She tracked the medication schedule in a small notebook. She fielded calls from extended family and translated what was happening into terms people could actually use. She managed the questions her siblings couldn't hold. She made sure her father ate, made sure the room was calm, made sure everyone else had somewhere to put what they were feeling. At some point, the man took my hand and asked me something I wasn't expecting. He said, "Who's gonna hold all of this together after I'm gone?" He wasn't asking about logistics. He meant the family, the emotional structure of it, the invisible load-bearing system. And he already knew the answer. He was looking at her when he asked. What I noticed, and what I've kept returning to for years since, is that she didn't know he was looking at her. She didn't know she was that person. Or she knew it the way you know something you've never said out loud. Not quite knowing it yet, Jung spent much of his early career studying what he called the family complex. Not the family as a social unit, but the family as a psychological field. A system in which each member unconsciously occupies a function. Something is distributed without being assigned. One person carries the anxiety the others can't afford. One person carries the grief. One person carries the competence, the calm, the capacity to hold what everyone else is dropping. In Volume 17 of the collected works, The Development of Personality, he wrote about what happens to the child who is shaped not by their own nature, but by what the system around them requires. He was precise about this. The role doesn't get chosen. It develops the way a callus develops, in response to sustained pressure, without anyone deciding it, without anyone naming it, often without anyone noticing it, including the person wearing it. He called individuation, the process of becoming who you actually are, separate from the function the system assigned, both a gift and, his word, a curse, because it requires something most people find unexpectedly difficult. Recognizing that the role you've been filling was a role and not simply who you are. That recognition usually starts with something concrete. Here are 7 signs. The first is that you became the mediator before you had language for what that meant, not officially, not by appointment, but when tension moved through your family, between parents, between siblings, between the surface of things and what was actually happening underneath, something in you moved toward it. You didn't always know what to do. You found yourself saying something, or changing the subject at exactly the right moment, or staying close enough that your presence became the calming thing, without anyone understanding why your presence was calming. Jung observed that, in most families, one person's nervous system ends up functioning as a kind of emotional thermostat for the group, not by choice, but because their system was calibrated very early to read fluctuations in the field and respond before those fluctuations became crises. What adults in the family called maturity was usually something earlier than maturity, an adaptation that formed under pressure. The second sign is that you stopped asking for certain things, not everything, but the large things, the help that required someone to set their own needs down and attend fully to yours. Those you stopped asking for. At some point, you made a quiet calculation the way children do without knowing they're doing it, and the calculation was, there is no one here who has what I would need for this, so you learned to need less, or to meet the need yourself, or to wait until it passed. Researchers who study parentification, the phenomenon where children take on emotional or functional roles that belong to adults, have noted that one of its most consistent signatures is not behavior, but its absence. The child who grows up caring more than their share doesn't act out. They learn that acting out is a cost the system cannot afford, so they become instead remarkably self-contained, calm, capable, and private about their interior in ways that tend to last long into adulthood. The third is that you processed other people's emotional states before you processed your own. You would walk into a room and know, not vaguely but specifically, that something was off between two people who were pretending there wasn't. You would feel the shift before anything was said, and your attention would go there first. Jung wrote about this as a feature of certain psychological configurations, a permeability to emotional atmosphere that isn't a strategy or a skill, but an orientation. The world arrives emotionally first. Other people's states register as data before your own do. What takes longer to see is what this trains you to leave behind. Yourself as a first concern. The person who grew up navigating by others' emotional weather often arrives at adulthood without reliable practice of asking simply, "How am I doing right now?" Not because they're unaware, because the habit of that question was never installed. I noticed this in myself. Years into hospice work, I could read a room full of grieving strangers in under a minute, who was holding it together, who was about to fall apart, where the tension lived. What I couldn't always tell you was how I was doing that same afternoon. The fourth is a particular kind of silence. Not empty silence, not distant silence. The silence of someone who is holding something the room cannot currently hold, and knows it. The silence that the people around you, over time, learned to take as evidence that things were okay when you were present. You became a source of stability you never applied for. That's the sign, not the silence itself, but what the silence was doing. It had a function in the system. Others organized around it without realizing they were organizing around it. The fifth is that you knew something was wrong in the family long before it was named. Children who grow up in genuinely well-functioning systems don't usually need to be that alert. The need for early, precise reading of the system's health is itself a sign of a system whose health required monitoring. What this produces over time is a kind of knowing that doesn't always have a visible source. You sensed things. You understood dynamics. You could predict with quiet accuracy how certain situations would unfold. The adults in the room mistook this for unusual maturity or sensitivity or an extraordinary temperament. Jung would have said it's something earlier than any of those things. It's the competence that forms under sustained uncertainty, when the alternative to understanding the system is being caught off guard by it. The sixth is that you rarely cried in front of your family, not because you didn't feel, but because, and this is where it gets precise, there was no obvious container for it. To cry in front of your family required something from them, and you had absorbed very early that the direction of requirement ran the other way. You were the one things came toward, not the direction things came from. So you learned other exits: private, deferred, oblique. Some people shaped this way find they can cry easily in front of strangers, in films, over things that seem entirely beside the point, because the actual grief has no designated place, and it leaks through every opening that isn't the original one. The seventh sign is the one that usually doesn't surface until much later, and it's the one that takes the most sitting with. You think of your family as a responsibility you never agreed to, and also one you can't quite set down. Not from guilt, exactly, not from simple obligation, but because somewhere in your formation, the stability of the system became woven into your sense of who you are. Your own steadiness became contingent on theirs. The function found you before you had any way to question whether you wanted it, and over time it became hard to separate the function from the self. Jung wrote in volume 17 that this is the most difficult part of individuation, not separating from the people, but separating from the psychological field, seeing clearly enough which parts of what you've been carrying actually belong to you and which parts belong to a role the system required. He was careful about this. He didn't call it rejection. He called it the necessary prerequisite for genuine relationship. The person who identifies unconsciously with the function the family assigned can never fully meet the people in the family as themselves, because they are always slightly occupied with being what the system needs them to be. After the man in the hospice room died, I spoke with his daughter a few times. She kept managing things. The arrangements, the paperwork, the family's grief, the logistics of what came next, the way she always had. But there was one afternoon when she sat in a chair outside her father's room, empty now, and didn't do anything. Wasn't crying, wasn't on the phone. She was just still in a way I hadn't seen her be still before. She said quietly, more to herself than to me, "I don't know when I decided this was my job. I didn't have an answer for that. I'm not sure there is one." But I've returned to that sentence more times than I can count, because what I heard in it wasn't complaint. It was something more precise. The first moment she'd allowed herself to notice that she had been inside a function, not just living a life. That the strength everyone relied on had not arrived from nowhere. It had a history, it had a cost, and it had, at some point, been hers to examine. Jung would have recognized that moment. He would have called it the beginning of something. The strongest person in the family is almost never the one who declared it. They were shaped into it by what the system needed and couldn't otherwise provide. That shaping was real. The strength it built was real. What it costs, and what you find on the other side of actually knowing it was there, that's real too.